Hi, you are now in a quiet place where everything fades and relaxation takes over. So welcome to another episode. Let the past drifts by softly. There's no need to stay fully awake. Tonight, we're returning to old Europe, not for battles or royalty, but for something much quieter. A mystery buried in the ground. It begins with a grave. Archaeologists were working in a centuries-old plague cemetery when they uncovered something strange, a skeleton with a brick placed carefully in its mouth. Not dropped, not broken, but deliberately lodged there before the earth was closed. And this wasn't the only one. Across Europe, similar burials have been found. Stones, bricks, and iron objects placed inside the mouths of the dead, as if something needed to be silenced or stopped. Why did people do this? What were they afraid of? In this episode, we'll explore medieval fears about the restless dead, ancient medical beliefs about the mouth and spirit, and the quiet rituals people once used to keep the night and the grave at peace. So if you're already tucked in, let your shoulders relax, let your eyes grow heavy, and together we'll take a gentle step back in time to uncover why some people were buried with bricks in their mouths. In the year 2006, on a small, quiet island just off the coast of Venice, a group of archaeologists were working carefully in the warm, dusty light. The island was called Lazaretto Nuovo, and it had long been known as a site of historical interest. Once a quarantine station during the plague years, it held centuries of secrets beneath its soil. The team's task was to excavate a 16th-century burial ground, a plague pit where hundreds of victims had been hastily buried during one of Venice's many outbreaks. Their work was slow and methodical. Each skeleton was brushed free of earth and catalogued. Most of them were what one might expect from a site like this. Bodies placed quickly in shallow graves, sometimes layered one on top of another, with little ceremony. These were the victims of panic and necessity, people who had died during times when the plague moved faster than custom could keep up with. And then they found something different. It was the remains of a woman. The bones were old, weathered by time, but still clearly human. Her skull had been well preserved, but it was what was inside her mouth that made the team stop. A brick, a full-sized piece of masonry, lodged between her teeth, keeping her jaw slightly open. It had not fallen there by chance. The way it sat told a different story. It had been placed there, deliberately, as part of her burial. Someone, long ago, had opened her mouth and inserted the brick before burying her. At first, the archaeologists were unsure what to make of it. Perhaps it was symbolic. Perhaps it was a mistake, the result of collapsing earth or shifting debris. But the more they examined her, the more it became clear this was not an accident. This was intentional. And it was not the only case. News of the discovery spread quietly through archaeological circles, and soon, similar reports emerged from other parts of Europe. In England, in Poland, in Germany, graves had been found where the dead had stones or bricks placed inside their mouths. Sometimes it was iron. Sometimes it was a coin. But always, it seemed, the object had been put there as a kind of stopper. As if the mouth was something to be blocked. As if silence had to be enforced. The woman from Venice quickly became a figure of fascination. She was dubbed the Vampire of Venice by the press, a name that drew attention, but not quite accuracy. There were no signs of violence on her bones. No injuries. No markings that suggested she had been feared in life. And yet, she had been buried in a way that hinted at unease. Caution. Even fear. Who was she? We don't know her name. We don't know how she lived, or exactly how she died. But we do know that someone, at the time of her death, believed there was a reason to treat her differently. A reason to make sure that her mouth would not open again. That whatever breath, spirit, or sound had once passed through her lips would stay sealed inside the earth. It's easy, in the modern world, to find this strange. We are used to seeing death as the end, final, still, undisturbed. We think of burial as something peaceful. We expect the dead to lie quietly in clean cemeteries, undisturbed by time. But in the past, death was a more uncertain thing. The line between life and death was thinner. Fear lingered, especially during times of plague. And when people could not explain what was happening around them, they turned to stories, superstitions, and rituals. The idea of a body returning after death was not just a tale for children. It was, in some places, a real possibility, one that required prevention. People believed in the restless dead, individuals who might rise from the grave to spread disease, cause misfortune, or haunt the living. And so, certain burials were done with precautions. Sometimes this meant pinning a body down with rocks. Sometimes it meant driving stakes through the chest. And sometimes, it meant silencing the mouth. The mouth was seen as powerful, a gateway through which the spirit could leave or return. To block it was not an act of cruelty. It was a form of protection, a quiet safeguard, just in case. On that island in Venice, surrounded by water and worn stone, the woman with the brick in her mouth remains one of the clearest pieces of evidence we have for this practice. Her grave tells a story not just of one person, but of an entire belief system. One shaped by fear, uncertainty, and an urgent desire to keep death contained. We may never know what her neighbors thought of her, whether they whispered about her in life, or only after she had passed, whether she had shown signs of illness, or died too quickly for comfort. But the brick tells us that something about her death, or what followed, left others uneasy. And so, they placed a heavy object between her teeth. They laid her down, and they covered her over with earth, not just to bury her, but to stop her. To this day, archaeologists continue to uncover similar graves. Some are older, some are newer, but all of them share that same strange, solemn feature: a body at rest and a mouth blocked. It is easy to dismiss these burials as folklore, as fear run wild, but they remind us of something important, that for much of history, people were doing their best to understand the unknown, to make sense of death, and to protect themselves from what they could not explain. In the stillness of the plague pits, under centuries of dust and stone, these ancient fears remain, and the woman with the brick in her mouth rests quietly among them, her story once buried, now gently brought back into the light. In the soft candlelight of medieval Europe, where shadows played along the stone walls of churches and cottages, death was not simply an ending. For many, it was a crossing, one that could, under certain circumstances, be reversed. The dead were expected to remain still, to lie quietly in their graves, undisturbed. But not all of them did. In the minds of many across the continent, there lingered a quiet fear that some people, after death, might return. These were not ghosts in the modern sense, not wisps or harmless echoes. These were physical beings, bodies, not just spirits, flesh, not just memory. They were called revenants, a word drawn from the Latin revenire, meaning to come back. And these revenants were feared. They appeared in countless folk tales, whispered during long winters or murmured near bedsides when illness crept in. Across England, France, Germany, Poland, and the Balkans, there were stories of the dead rising, not always to seek vengeance, but to bring misfortune. Crops would fail, cattle would weaken, children would sicken, and it was said that the source of the trouble was someone who had already been buried. What made a person into a revenant? There was no single answer. In some regions, it was believed that those who died violently, by murder, suicide, or plague, were more likely to return. In others, suspicion fell on people who had not received a proper burial. Sometimes, it was simply the person who died first in a household, especially during a wave of disease. They were believed to draw the others to the grave, one by one. It wasn't always personal. Sometimes, it was just fear. Life was difficult. Death was common. And when things went wrong, when a family member died unexpectedly, or when strange things happened in the home, people looked for explanations. In a world without modern medicine or science, those explanations were shaped by tradition, by religion, and by the stories passed down for generations. The revenant was a convenient answer to a terrifying question. Why is this still happening? If someone died, and then others around them followed, it must be because they had returned. Not visibly, not always with fanfare, but in a hidden, harmful way. Perhaps their spirit had escaped. Perhaps they walked in the night. Perhaps their open mouth still whispered curses from beneath the soil. And so, precautions were taken. Many of these precautions were subtle. Some were deeply ritualistic, and some left physical traces in the grave. Across Europe, archaeologists have uncovered burials where something is not quite right. Skeletons with stones pressed into their mouths, bodies pinned with iron bars, skulls separated from spines. In some cases, large rocks were laid directly on top of a corpse's chest, not out of cruelty, but out of concern. Heavy objects to keep the dead where they belonged. One of the clearest patterns involves the mouth. The mouth was seen as a gateway, a threshold between the body and the world. It was where breath left, where words were spoken, where spirits might escape. A mouth left open in death was seen as a risk. It might allow something to leave, or worse, allow something to return. And so, it was stopped. Sometimes gently, with a coin, perhaps, or a small stone. Sometimes more forcefully, with a brick or a shard of pottery wedged firmly between the teeth. These were not decorations. They were not offerings. They were barriers. A message, carved not in words, but in weight. Some scholars believe these practices were part of a broader European fear of the undead, not the romantic vampires of fiction, but the bloated, smelly, wandering corpses of older folklore. Creatures that fed on life not with charm, but with disease and despair. In Eastern Europe, these beliefs were particularly strong. Villages in parts of Romania, Bulgaria, and Serbia once held customs for dealing with suspected revenants. Corpses were sometimes exhumed, checked for signs of movement or rot, and reburied with a stake through the chest or a sickle laid across the neck, to prevent them from rising again. These stories are not merely legend. In some regions, they appear in official records, even court documents. The fear was real enough to prompt action, and sometimes even legal approval. In Western Europe, the rituals were often quieter. The Church officially condemned such beliefs, declaring that the dead could not return, and that to interfere with a burial was sinful. But old habits persisted, especially in rural areas where folk beliefs ran deep. A priest might say one thing. A family, worried and grieving, might do another. In some places, children were taught never to speak ill of the dead, not just out of respect, but out of fear that their words might awaken someone best left undisturbed. Others placed herbs, iron nails, or salt near a corpse, hoping to keep bad spirits at bay. And in a few rare but telling cases, someone placed a brick in the mouth of the deceased. It's important to understand the mindset behind these acts. To modern eyes, they might seem grim or superstitious. But to those who practiced them, they were protective, small defenses in a world full of uncertainty. Just as we today might lock our doors or leave on a light at night, people in the past had their own ways of feeling safe. The brick was not a punishment. It was a seal, a way to ensure that what had happened, the illness, the death, the fear, would not repeat itself. That the person in the grave would rest, and that those left behind could sleep in peace. In this way, the belief in revenants shaped not only stories and customs, but the very ground beneath our feet. In quiet churchyards, under forgotten earth, lie the bones of people who were once feared, not for what they had done, but for what they might still do. Their mouths, gently stopped with stone or brick, are silent now, but their burials still speak, telling us about the quiet anxieties of a world that once lived and died in the shadow of uncertainty. To understand why someone in the past would be buried with a brick in their mouth, we need to step back from the modern world, with its scientific language and biological certainty, and instead consider how people once viewed the body, the soul, and the mysterious space in between. In medieval Europe, the human body was not simply flesh and bone. It was a vessel, a bridge between the physical and the spiritual, between earth and the heavens. Every part of the body had meaning, and among the most powerful was the mouth. The mouth was more than a place for speech or eating. It was a point of entry and escape. People believed that the soul, when it left the body at the moment of death, exited through the mouth. In paintings, death was often shown as a small puff, a wisp, sometimes a little figure or winged spirit slipping past the lips of the dying. The mouth was the last place the soul touched, but it was also the first place something else might return. This belief wasn't necessarily formal theology. The church didn't teach it directly, but it lived in the minds of ordinary people. The mouth, left open in death, was vulnerable, a gateway through which evil spirits might enter, or through which something inside might stir and try to rise again. And so, special attention was paid to it. In many cultures, the dead were prepared with care. Their eyes were closed, their limbs were arranged, and their mouths were gently shut. But if someone died suddenly, in violence, or from plague, these rituals might be rushed or forgotten. In such cases, the open mouth became a source of concern. Something needed to be done. Because if a person had died under strange or frightening circumstances, their soul might be restless. And a restless soul, it was believed, could become dangerous. The mouth was also seen as a tool of power. It was where words came from, and in a world where words could heal or curse, where blessings and spells were spoken aloud, this mattered deeply. The same lips that once whispered prayers could also, in some imaginations, mutter dark things from the grave. Some believed that the mouth of a corpse might begin to move again. Not to speak, necessarily, but to chew. Yes, to chew. This idea, strange as it may seem, appears in writings from the medieval and early modern period. There were rumors that some corpses, especially during plague years, would begin to eat while in the grave. Not food, but the cloth of their burial shrouds. It was said they gnawed at their own clothing, consuming it slowly, and that this act somehow spread disease. These beings were called shroud eaters, and they were deeply feared. To prevent this from happening, people developed rituals. One was the use of objects to fill or block the mouth, not just to close it physically, but to stop it from moving at all. A brick, in this case, was more than just a convenient object. It was symbolic, heavy, irregular, something that could not be swallowed or passed, something that would remain, even after the body decayed. A final silence, imposed by the living. Other cultures had similar practices. In ancient Greece and Rome, coins were placed in the mouth of the dead, not to silence them, but as payment to Charon, the ferryman who carried souls across the river Styx. The mouth, again, was the site of transition, a place where the journey between life and afterlife began. In Christian Europe, coins were sometimes used too, though more often they were placed on the eyes. But in folk tradition, when the dead were thought to pose a threat, different objects appeared. Stones, shards of pottery, and of course, bricks. What these items had in common was their solidness, their permanence. A message, perhaps, not to the soul itself, but to the body, or to the people left behind. Stay still. Remain quiet. Do not return. It's easy to imagine these acts as fearful or even violent, but often, they were likely done with care. The person performing the ritual may have loved the one who had died. They may have mourned them, but fear, especially in the face of unexplained illness or strange dreams, can lead people to do things that feel necessary, even if they seem odd to us today. The mouth was also linked to breath, and breath, in many belief systems, was life itself. In Hebrew, the word for breath is rosh, which also means spirit. In Latin, spiritus means both breath and soul. In Greek, pneuma carries the same dual meaning. So to stop the mouth was not just about blocking speech. It was about stopping movement, preventing breath, and by extension, preventing life. Of course, we now know that a body in the grave cannot chew or rise. We understand decomposition. We know about bacteria, gases, and the illusions they can create. But to people of the past, who watched a loved one die and then saw others in the house grow sick, who heard stories of groaning graves and moving shrouds, these explanations were not available. They had stories instead, and rituals, and bricks. Sometimes, people used other methods. In parts of Europe, corpses were buried face down, to confuse them, should they rise. Others were buried with iron nails in their mouth or driven through their limbs. A sickle placed across the neck was meant to decapitate the body should it stir. In every case, the goal was the same: to stop what had begun, to keep the boundary between life and death intact. The mouth, as the final passage, had to be secured. When archaeologists uncover these graves today, they find not only bones, but echoes of these quiet beliefs. A brick in a mouth may seem crude, but it tells a story of fear, of protection, of people trying to guard themselves from the unknown. And while we may not believe the same things anymore, we can still recognize the human feeling behind it. That deep, instinctive desire to make sense of death, and to feel just a little more safe. The first time you see it, it's a little jarring. A human skull, centuries old, with a rough brick placed firmly in the open space of the mouth. At first glance, it looks unnatural, brutal, even. But as we begin to understand the layers of belief, fear, and tradition behind this act, we come to see the brick not as an act of violence, but of caution and, perhaps, compassion. In medieval Europe, the dead were not always at peace, and the living, uncertain of what might stir beneath the soil, developed rituals to ensure that the boundary between this world and the next remained firm. We've seen how the mouth was viewed as a gateway, a passage through which spirits might rise or dangerous forces escape. To place something in that mouth was to close the door. And among the objects used, the brick held a particular weight, both literal and symbolic. But why a brick? At first, it might seem like an odd choice. Bricks were building materials, not religious items or sacred symbols. They were rough, irregular, and entirely practical. But perhaps that's exactly the point. In a time of crisis, when people died suddenly from plague or were buried in haste, people used what they had. A brick was solid, heavy, irregular in shape, hard to remove once placed. It could not easily be swallowed or shifted as the body decayed. Once lodged in the mouth, it stayed there. Some scholars believe that the brick acted as a kind of spiritual plug, not just a physical blockage, but a symbolic seal. By placing it in the mouth, mourners might have believed they were trapping something inside. The breath, the soul, or whatever force they feared might escape. In this sense, the brick was not just a stopper, but a seal, an end point. It's also worth considering what bricks represented in daily life. They were used to build homes, hearths, ovens, the centers of warmth and safety. A brick was familiar, reliable, man-made. Unlike bones, which decayed, or cloth, which rotted, a brick endured. It could be trusted to hold its shape, to press downward with weight and certainty. In a burial context, it became a kind of quiet guardian, not against outside threats, but against what might come from within. Of course, bricks were not the only objects placed in the mouths of the dead. Archaeologists have found other examples across Europe. Small stones, shards of pottery, coins, even pieces of metal or thorns. Each of these served the same general purpose: to block, to silence, to contain. But the brick stands out because of its size and presence. It fills the mouth completely, holding the jaw open in a way that is visibly, unmistakably deliberate. There may also be a symbolic link to speech. The mouth is where words are formed, prayers, names, promises. It is also where curses might be uttered. Some traditions held that a person who had died with a grudge or unfinished business might try to speak again, from the grave or in dreams. To prevent this, the mouth was stopped. In this way, the brick becomes not just a physical object, but a spiritual silencer. It removes the possibility of sound. It says, "This chapter is finished." There's also an interesting parallel with the idea of justice. In some ancient traditions, the dead were believed to be judged in the afterlife by what they had said in life. Words, once spoken, could not be taken back. In Egypt, for example, there were spells to ensure that the dead would not speak ill or lie during their judgment. In medieval Europe, while the theology was different, the anxiety about words, especially dangerous or sinful ones, remained. So, a blocked mouth might serve to protect the soul as much as the living. It was a way of saying, this person will remain silent now. No more harm will be done, to others or themselves. There are even cases where the placement of the brick seems almost ceremonial. In some burials, the object is not simply shoved into the mouth, but carefully positioned. Sometimes a second object, like a small stone, is placed beneath the chin to support the jaw. This tells us that the act was not one of panic, but of ritual. A moment of intention, even if the surrounding burial was hurried or simple. This gives the brick a deeper meaning. It's not just a response to fear, but a gesture of control. In a time when plague made people feel helpless, and death came without warning, small rituals gave structure to the chaos. To place a brick in a loved one's mouth was to reclaim some measure of power, to draw a boundary, to say, "This ends here." Of course, not all historians agree on the interpretation. Some suggest more practical reasons. Perhaps the mouth was open and needed support, or the brick served to weigh the head down in a shallow grave. But these explanations don't quite fit the pattern. The same object, placed in the same way, turning up in multiple countries and contexts, suggests something more than practicality. It suggests belief. And belief, even when undocumented, leaves marks. The most famous example remains the Venetian woman, the skeleton discovered in 2006 on the island of Lazaretto Nuovo. She had been buried in a plague pit with dozens of others, but unlike them, she had a brick in her mouth. Her jaw was slightly ajar. Her teeth, still intact after centuries, were pressed against the rough stone. The archaeologists who found her didn't just record the find. They paused. They felt the moment. Because even now, even surrounded by science and tools and notebooks, the sight of that brick stirred something ancient. A reminder that someone, long ago, had placed it there for a reason. A reason lost to time, but not to imagination. So the brick, silent as it is, continues to speak. It tells us about fear, about hope, about the human need to make sense of death, and to keep the world safe, even if that means sealing a mouth forever. To understand why someone might be buried with a brick in their mouth, we must not only examine belief and symbolism, we must also consider context. The wider picture, the world they lived in, and the moment in which death occurred. And few moments in European history brought more fear and urgency than the time of the plague. When we speak of the plague, most people think of the Black Death, the great pandemic of the mid-14th century that swept across Europe, killing millions in just a few short years. But the Black Death was not a one-time event. In fact, the disease returned again and again in waves, in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, each time bringing fresh waves of fear, confusion, and death. Cities emptied. Villages were abandoned. Streets once filled with merchants and laughter grew silent. Whole households disappeared in a matter of days. And no one truly understood why. They knew it spread fast, that it often began with fever and ended in stillness, that it traveled with frightening speed through neighborhoods and households. But they didn't know about bacteria or fleas or infected rats. Germ theory would not arrive for centuries. So they turned, instead, to what they did know, or at least, what they had heard. They turned to stories, to suspicions, and to ritual. In plague times, the process of death was not peaceful. Victims died in pain, often alone, and quickly. There was little time for farewells or ceremony. Burial was rushed. Graves were dug by the dozens. In some cases, the dead were stacked in pits and covered over as quickly as possible. Families didn't always know what became of their loved ones. This created a deep sense of unease, not just grief, but fear. A fear that the dead were not at rest, that something had gone wrong. In a traditional Christian burial, there were steps to be followed, prayers to be said. The body was washed, wrapped, and laid to rest in consecrated ground. But during the plague, those rituals often broke down. Priests were overwhelmed. Deaths came too fast. Graves were dug wherever there was space, sometimes on the outskirts of town, sometimes in old fields, and sometimes in the corners of churchyards that had already been filled. People began to worry, not just that the soul might be lost, but that the body, denied its proper rights, might turn dangerous. And so, we see a rise in unusual burials. Some plague victims were buried with stones or iron in their mouths. Others were pinned down with weights or covered with thorns. There are reports of corpses buried face down, as if to confuse them. And in a few remarkable cases, such as the Venetian woman on Lazaretto Nuovo, a brick was placed in the mouth. This was not, it seems, random. Nor was it a general practice. It was selective. Certain people, not many, But some were treated differently. Their bodies marked by a particular kind of anxiety. Why? One theory is that these individuals were seen as carriers, not just of disease, but of misfortune. Perhaps they were the first in their household to die. Perhaps they were strangers, or outsiders, or people who had once been the subject of rumors. In moments of panic, suspicion rises easily. And if someone began to suspect that a particular corpse was dangerous, even in death, they might act. These acts were not necessarily acts of hatred. They may have been born from sorrow and desperation. A person might have placed a brick in the mouth of their own relative, not because they wished them harm, but because they feared what might happen if they didn't. In plague times, even love could become cautious. There are also records of burials being reopened. In Eastern Europe in particular, there are documented cases of communities digging up the dead to check for signs of unnatural behavior. If a body had not decomposed as expected, or if fresh blood appeared at the mouth, people assumed the corpse had become restless. To prevent this, they would sometimes remove the heart, sever the head, or, again, block the mouth. These were not everyday acts. They were rare, but they were real, and they speak to something deep and human, the need to act, even when nothing can truly be done. In the face of death, especially when it arrives in terrifying numbers, people long for control. Rituals, even strange ones, give that sense of control back, if only for a moment. The island of Lazaretto Nuovo, where the brick-in-mouth burial was found, was itself a place shaped by plague. Its very name, Lazaretto, refers to quarantine. It was one of several islands in the Venetian lagoon used to isolate the sick. Ships arriving in Venice were held offshore, and their passengers and cargo kept away from the city until it was clear they carried no disease. And yet, even with these precautions, the plague still came. Over and over again. Each time, people adapted. They developed new customs, new stories, new fears, and sometimes, those fears found their way into the grave. The woman with the brick may have died of plague. She may have been one of the first, or perhaps she died late, when panic had fully taken hold. We do not know what those who buried her believed, but we know they made a choice. They placed that brick with intention, and then they buried her and moved on. And for centuries, she lay quietly beneath the soil, a small part of a larger tragedy. It's easy to look back on these actions with disbelief, to think, how strange, how superstitious. But we live in a world of modern medicine, of information at our fingertips. They did not. They lived in a world where the cause of death was invisible, sudden, and total. A world where illness took whole families in days. A world without antibiotics, without hospitals, without any real explanation. In that world, a brick in the mouth of the dead made perfect sense. It was not just a barrier. It was a prayer, a silent one that said, "Please, stay gone." When we think of the past, we often imagine that people lived in certainty, that they believed what they were taught and followed traditions without question. But the truth is more complicated. People in medieval and early modern Europe lived in a world full of uncertainty. Disease could strike at any time. Weather patterns changed without warning. Dreams carried meaning, and the boundary between the natural and supernatural was thin. In that world, superstition wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven into it. It shaped choices, whispered in the background, and guided small, quiet actions meant to keep loved ones safe. Especially during times of illness, when the world felt unstable, people turned to protective customs, many of which now seem strange to modern eyes. One of the strongest motivations behind these customs was protection, not just from the dead, but from what might follow after death. Many feared that if a body wasn't buried properly, or if death occurred in an unnatural way, something harmful could linger. It might be an evil spirit, a curse, or a kind of lingering energy that spread sickness or misfortune. And so, communities across Europe developed ways to contain the dead, to seal them off, spiritually as well as physically. The brick in the mouth, while rare, fits into this wider pattern. It was part of a group of burial practices designed not only to honor the dead, but to protect the living. A small action, done quietly, that carried enormous symbolic weight. a final gesture of safety in a world that did not always feel safe. This desire to protect was especially strong during outbreaks of disease. Plague, in particular, brought about a storm of panic and grief. With so many people dying so quickly, rumors and suspicions spread just as fast. If one person in a household died, others might follow soon after, and when that happened, people naturally looked for a cause. If no answer could be found in the world of medicine, they turned to belief. What if the first person to die had brought it upon the others? What if their spirit hadn't left peacefully? What if something was still moving, unseen, but deadly? In this emotional atmosphere, superstition offered comfort. It gave people a way to act. To place a brick in the mouth of a deceased person wasn't just about fear. It was about doing something, about giving shape to the unknown. And while it might sound irrational today, it's worth remembering that the line between science and superstition was much blurrier in the past. In medieval medical theory, health depended on balance, not just of the body, but of the soul. The humus theory, inherited from ancient Greece, taught that each person carried 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness occurred when these were out of balance. Doctors believed that posture, sleep, mood, diet, even astrology could influence health. Certain times of day were better for treatment. Particular directions in which you slept could affect your digestion. And illness was not always seen as a purely natural thing. It could be a punishment from God or the work of demons. It could come from bad air, but also from bad energy, spiritual or moral pollution. In this worldview, a person who died during a plague might still carry danger after death. Their body could give off miasmas, foul, invisible vapors. Their soul might remain unsettled, and their physical remains might serve as a source of spiritual infection. This is why so many folk customs focused on sealing, blocking, and weighing down the dead. In Poland, for example, some graves contain sickles placed across the neck or abdomen, not to harm the corpse, but to cut any spiritual bond that might remain. In parts of Germany and Austria, stones were placed on chests or under chins. In Romania, people once buried suspected vampires with stakes through the heart. And in Italy, a brick placed in the mouth was one more way of saying, "This body is closed. No further passage is permitted." Not all of this was based in fear of evil, however. Some customs were simply meant to provide peace for the dead and the living. A closed mouth meant the soul had left fully, that there was no lingering breath, no final whisper trapped in the body. It was a way of saying goodbye with certainty. And the idea of closing the mouth appears in other traditions as well. In some Jewish customs, the mouth of the deceased is gently closed, and a cloth tied around the chin to hold it in place. In Hindu traditions, water or sacred herbs are sometimes placed in the mouth as a purifying act. In ancient Egypt, there was even a special ritual called the opening of the mouth, performed so the dead could eat, speak, and breathe in the afterlife. The idea that the mouth serves as a key spiritual gateway is deeply ancient and surprisingly widespread. But what sets the brick-in-mouth burials apart is their tone. These were not rituals of blessing or farewell. They were acts of containment. Something had gone wrong, either in the person's death or in how it was perceived. And the brick was placed there not for honor, but for closure. And yet, even in that closure, there may have been compassion. Because those who buried the dead, even in fear, still took time to act. To stop. To mark the grave. To add a small, solid object, perhaps believing that it would prevent further sorrow. That it might stop whatever was spreading, and save those who were left behind. In a strange way, the brick becomes a symbol of love, not romantic love, or even warm affection, but the hard, anxious love of survival. Of trying to protect one's family, one's neighbors, one's village. And that's something we can all understand. Today, archaeologists look back at these graves not with mockery, but with respect. Because they tell us something profound, that even in history's darkest times, people tried to protect one another. That even when death was all around them, they looked for ways to draw a line, to hold the chaos at bay. A brick in the mouth is not just a superstition. It's a shield, a small, silent promise, You may rest, and we may live. As we move further from the time when bricks were placed in the mouths of the dead, it might be tempting to think such practices were left behind completely, strange fragments of a fearful age. But the truth is, even as science progressed and medicine improved, the echoes of these old beliefs did not vanish overnight. They lived on, not always in physical ritual, but in stories, in symbols, and in the quiet corners of culture that linger long after people stop thinking about where they came from. In every society, fear leaves a trace. And for centuries in Europe, the fear of the restless dead, of the soul that did not pass on properly, or the body that might return, left its mark on folk traditions, bedtime stories, and local legends. These stories didn't disappear with the Enlightenment. In fact, some of them became stronger. Take the vampire, for example. Today, we think of vampires as elegant creatures of fiction, pale, mysterious, often romantic. But the older vampire, the one who haunted the imaginations of rural Eastern Europe, was quite different. He was bloated, red-faced, and foul-smelling. He didn't charm. He infected. He spread disease, death, and fear. And he was often associated with improper burials. The vampire, in many ways, is a cultural cousin to the revenant, that feared figure who returned from the grave because something had gone wrong. A ritual was missed, a sin left unconfessed, or a disease misunderstood. In many parts of rural Europe, from the Balkans to Poland, vampire legends were directly tied to disease outbreaks. When a village suffered too many deaths in a short time, suspicions would arise. Who was buried first? Was their mouth open? Had their body been disturbed? And so, even in the 18th century, a time when great cities like London and Paris were debating the rights of man and the movement of planets, small villages were still exhuming bodies, placing bricks in mouths, staking chests, and lighting fires over old graves. It wasn't ignorance. It was fear. And fear does not obey the calendar. In Britain, the idea of the revenant also persisted. Stories told of people rising from their graves, not to drink blood, but to knock on doors, spread plague, or terrify entire towns. The 12th century chronicler William of Newburgh described several such cases, one in Yorkshire, where a man was believed to have returned night after night until his body was dug up and burned. These tales weren't fringe gossip. They were recorded by monks, passed on in manuscripts, believed by many. Even Shakespeare tapped into these fears. In Hamlet, when the ghost of the dead king appears, it is a deeply unsettling event. Not just because he is a ghost, but because he has returned without peace, unable to rest until something is set right. The line between natural death and spiritual unrest was thin, and storytellers crossed it often. These themes also appear in religious plays and early dramas. The idea that the soul could linger, or that something dark might be released if death was not handled correctly, was a source of tension and caution. People were told to confess their sins, make peace with their neighbors, and be buried in consecrated ground. Not only for their own sake, but for the peace of the community. And it wasn't only the spoken or written word. These ideas seeped into symbols, into charms, paintings, and architecture. Grave markers in some parts of Europe featured carvings designed to protect the dead from harm, or to protect the living from what lay beneath. Crosses, circles, knots, and eye-shaped motifs were carved into stones and lintels. Some homes placed protective markings above doorways, especially during plague years, a sign not only to God, but to wandering spirits that this household was guarded. Even in churches, you can find echoes of these fears. The tradition of placing a stone gargoyle on the roof wasn't just decorative. It was protective. A watcher, a guardian, a reminder that the line between sacred and profane, between the living and the dead, was always there, but never quite solid. In folk songs, too, we find lingering anxiety about the grave. Ballads tell of young lovers who die, only to return briefly to warn the living, or to express longing, or to finish something left undone. In some versions of these tales, the dead are said to rise at night, their mouths silent but expressive, their presence both mournful and unsettling. Even today, the idea of the unquiet dead remains a powerful image. Horror films build entire plots around improperly buried corpses, unsolved deaths, and the failure to respect rituals. These modern stories draw, whether consciously or not, from the very same fears that once led someone to place a brick in the mouth of the deceased. And beyond fear, there is something else, a strange kind of comfort. These rituals, while dark to us, offered structure. They gave people a sense that they could influence the unknown. That even in death, there were rules. That by doing something, even something as simple as closing the mouth, they could keep the world in order. That idea has never fully gone away. Think of how, even now, we speak of getting closure. We place flowers on graves. We whisper final words to the departed. We don't believe in revenants anymore, not really, but we still believe in the need to complete things, to honor what has passed, to make peace with death, however we can. So when archaeologists uncover a skeleton with a brick in its mouth, they are not just discovering an object or a practice. They are finding a story, not only of fear, but of meaning, of how people once coped with the hardest truth of all, that we die, and we do not always understand why. And yet, through ritual, story, and symbol, we try. We try to make sense of death, to contain it, to name it, to protect ourselves from it. And perhaps, in that effort, we are not so different from those who came before us. Those who lit candles, dug shallow graves, and placed a single brick in the open mouth of someone they once loved. The stories we've explored so far, of fear, folklore, ritual, and mystery, come from the minds and mouths of people who lived long ago. But how do we know these stories ever really happened? How do we separate rumor from reality, tale from truth? That's where archaeology steps in. Quietly, carefully, with gloves, brushes, and notebooks. Archaeology doesn't shout. It whispers. It finds small things, fragments of pottery, worn teeth, a misplaced stone, and from them, it begins to speak. And in the case of the brick-in-mouth burials, it is the archaeologists who have revealed some of the clearest clues we have about this strange and unsettling practice. Perhaps the most famous of these discoveries took place in 2006 on the island of Lazaretto Nuovo, just off the coast of Venice. The site was once a quarantine station, a place where ships arriving in the city were held during outbreaks of plague. It was a place of sickness, fear, and isolation. And beneath its soil, in a simple mass grave, archaeologists uncovered dozens of skeletons. Among them was one that stood out. It was a woman. Her skeleton was mostly intact, lying flat among the bones of others. But in her mouth, unmistakably, was a brick, lodged in her jaw, held between her teeth. This wasn't a case of random collapse or a building falling in. The brick was placed there, intentionally, and that told researchers something very important. Someone had made a choice. Her find was reported in news outlets around the world. Some headlines called her a vampire or a witch, though the archaeologists were far more cautious. They didn't claim she was seen as evil. What they said was more subtle, and perhaps more powerful. She had died during the plague, and someone feared she might come back. Since then, similar burials have been documented across Europe, in Poland, Austria, Germany, and even the British Isles. Most are rare, single finds in larger cemeteries, often in contexts of disease, war, or social unrest. And in nearly every case, there's a common thread. The brick, or stone, or object placed in the mouth seems to have been intended to prevent some kind of return. This pattern, small though it may be, has begun to reshape how we view certain burial sites. For example, in Poland, archaeologists found what they called anti-vampire burials, graves in which corpses had been pinned down with iron sickles or had stones placed beneath their chins. Some were buried with their heads turned sharply backwards, or with bricks laid across their necks. These were not mass graves. They were individual burials. Thoughtful, deliberate. In one case, the body had a sickle pressed across the throat. The idea, according to the researchers, was that if the body moved, it would decapitate itself. A harsh image, perhaps, but one rooted in folk beliefs about the dangers of unrestful dead. These findings help us in two important ways. First, they confirm that such practices did happen. They weren't just legends or rumors passed down over generations. They left physical traces, marks in the ground, Bones in strange positions. Bricks where no bricks belonged. Second, they help us see these practices as part of a larger cultural pattern. When we look at one grave alone, like the woman from Venice, it's tempting to see it as an oddity, a one-off. But when we begin to find similar graves hundreds of miles apart, and from similar time periods, the picture becomes clearer. People were responding to shared fears. They were acting from belief, and they were not alone. Of course, interpretation isn't always easy. Archaeology is not a perfect science. It involves a degree of guesswork, always grounded in evidence, but rarely offering total certainty. A brick in a mouth tells us something, yes, but not exactly why it was placed there. We must piece that together from context. Was the burial rushed? Was the person sick? Did the grave show signs of disturbance? Were there similar burials nearby? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes it's murkier. For example, in some plague pits, bodies were buried in such haste that standard rituals were abandoned altogether. In these chaotic conditions, odd burial positions or strange objects might appear, not from superstition, but from speed. A brick might have been placed there to hold the mouth shut, or to weigh down a shroud, or simply because it was nearby. But when the same practice is repeated, and always in the same manner, mouth open, object placed inside, it begins to look less like accident and more like belief. Archaeologists are especially interested in placement. When an object is found inside the mouth, rather than near the head or chest, it suggests intent. Someone had to put it there, gently, perhaps, carefully, in a moment that we will never see, but which left its mark in the earth. And even now, as modern tools, like ground-penetrating radar and chemical analysis, reveal more about these graves, the mystery remains partly intact. Not because we don't have enough evidence, but because some things resist final explanation. Fear, for example, is not always logical. It doesn't leave neat records or written instructions. It moves in silence, in gestures, in rituals passed down quietly, from mother to child, neighbor to neighbor. That's what these burials represent, the archaeology of fear. Not fear in a panicked, irrational sense, but fear as a cultural force. Something that shapes how we treat the dead, how we understand illness, how we cope with the unknown. And this, in turn, helps archaeologists build a more human picture of the past. Because buried within these graves is more than just history. There is emotion, sorrow, confusion, care. Whoever placed that brick in the mouth of the Venetian woman was not just following a rule. They were acting on something they believed. Perhaps they didn't even fully understand why, but it mattered to them. And so, they did it. Today, when we walk through old cemeteries or read reports from excavation sites, we see the results of these quiet decisions. A stone here, a bone out of place there, a strange way to cross a rib cage, and every now and then, a brick in a mouth, telling us, this was a time of fear. This was a time of care. This was a time when death could not be trusted to stay still. And so, after all the stories and the discoveries, what remains? A simple truth, that people in the past were afraid, just as we are. And when they didn't understand what was happening, when death came suddenly or in frightening ways, they looked for ways to protect themselves. The brick-in-mouth burial was one of those ways. It wasn't common, but it was powerful. Not because it had magical properties, but because it offered a sense of control. A quiet gesture, made in uncertainty, in grief, in hope. The brick didn't mock the dead. It guarded the living. It was a way of saying, let this end here. Let no more harm be done. And now, hundreds of years later, we uncover those old graves and try to read their stories. We don't always understand every detail, but we understand the feeling behind them. That blend of love, fear, sorrow, and care. It reminds us that history is not just made of battles and kings. It's also made of tiny, silent actions. A stone laid across a chest, a candle lit by a window, a brick placed gently between the teeth of the dead. In the end, we all want the same things: peace, protection, and the hope that when our time comes, someone will take care. Not perfectly, not with grandeur, but with whatever they have to hand. A prayer, a blanket, a brick. Sleep softly now and have a lovely night.